Have you ever wondered what really happened to the Confederate leaders after the Civil War? Was justice truly served? Or were they simply forgiven, with everything left unresolved? In this video, we're diving into one of the most controversial chapters in American history to answer those questions. Imagine a country torn apart and devastated by war, where the leaders responsible for secession and slavery continued to live freely without severe punishment. But why did this happen? The answer isn't as simple as it seems. Understanding the reasoning behind this decision is key to grasping the lasting impact it had on the justice system and the racial tensions that still echo to this day. Throughout this video, we'll not only explore the decisions made, but also what these choices meant for American society in the long term. You'll see how these decisions still influence U.S. politics and culture. And more, we'll question whether this was really a matter of forgiveness or merely a political strategy. So if you're interested in discovering what really happened and why it still matters, stick with us until the end. This journey through justice, or the lack thereof, will surprise you. Imagine the end of a devastating war, one of the most violent and divisive conflicts in American history. The Civil War had concluded, but the nation was far from being fully restored. On one side was the triumphant North, bearing the weight of lives lost and the hope of rebuilding a united country. On the other were the Confederate leaders, figures who, to many, represented racism, division, and suffering. Yet instead of facing severe punishment, something unexpected happened to these leaders. They were, in a way, forgiven and reintegrated into American society. Was this forgiveness truly a form of justice? Or was it a decision that would indelibly shape the nation's future, impacting generations to come? Today, we're going to dive into this controversial topic and ask, what did this choice to refrain from punishment actually mean? How strategic was it? And more importantly, what were the consequences of forgiving figures who in many ways had threatened the very ideals of American equality and freedom? In this video, we'll examine how this decision reverberated through American history, affecting everything from the justice system to the country's cultural legacy. Stick with us to discover how the concept of justice was shaped and perhaps distorted during one of the most critical moments in United States history, the Civil War and the end of conflict. To understand the weight and impact of the decision to forgive the Confederate leaders, we need to return to the starting point, the political and social landscape that divided the United States into North and South. The American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, was far more than a territorial or political dispute. At its core were fundamental values and human rights issues, especially the institution of slavery, a system that supported the Southern economy and social structure. In contrast, the North was fostering an industrialized economy and pushing for expanded civil rights, staunchly opposing slavery as both a practice and an economic system. The conflict, inevitable due to deep-rooted differences, culminated in a war that left indelible marks. Over 600,000 dead, cities in ruins, and a society split in half. At the end of the war, with the North's victory and the Confederate surrender, the Union faced a monumental question. How could a nation reunite after such widespread destruction and bitterness? Reconciliation was paramount, but there was also pressure to ensure Confederate leaders were punished for their role in the war and their defense of slavery. However, this decision was anything but simple. The Union, weighing reconciliation against punishment, recognized that any extreme measures could further complicate the task of rebuilding a newly fractured country. The choice came down to severe justice versus a chance for peaceful reunification. And it was within this dilemma that seeds were sown for a decision that would shape the fate of the United States for generations. The dilemmas of national reconciliation. After the Civil War ended, Union leaders faced one of the greatest political and social dilemmas in American history: how to handle those who had led the rebellion. The urgency of rebuilding and pacifying the country called for an approach that wouldn't alienate the South, yet there was also a powerful demand for justice. For many in the North, especially those who'd lost loved ones in the war, it was unthinkable that Confederate leaders could escape unscathed. Public pressure for retribution was intense, with punishment seen as a way to honor the lives lost and the suffering endured. On the other hand, President Abraham Lincoln had a vision for national unity that went beyond retaliation. He believed the nation's survival depended on a gradual rapprochement that wouldn't deepen the wounds left by the war. Lincoln advocated for reconciliation to proceed slowly, allowing the South to re-enter the Union without harboring resentment that might reignite conflict. His Reconstruction Plan, known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, offered forgiveness to Confederates who pledged loyalty to the Union, except for top-ranking leaders and major slaveholders. However, with Lincoln's assassination in 1865, his plan faced new challenges. His successor, Andrew Johnson, adopted an even more lenient stance, allowing many Confederate leaders to regain positions of influence in the South. This move, seen by many as forgiveness that disregarded justice, brought about complex consequences. The attempt to rebuild the country on a foundation of reconciliation was noble, but the execution of this policy created a cycle of resentment and impunity that would linger in America's collective memory. Justice or forgiveness? An analysis of political decisions. The decision to forgive or punish the Confederate leaders proved to be much more than a simple choice between leniency and strictness. It highlighted a profound conflict between the need for justice and the urgency for stability. For many politicians at the time, forgiveness was viewed as the most practical solution to preserve the Union and avoid new divisions. But it also meant sacrificing justice, which many considered essential. Ultimately, what prevailed was a reconciliatory approach, a form of justice that diverged from traditional punishments, allowing Confederates to return to their lives without significant legal repercussions. This debate set an important precedent on the role of justice in times of crisis. The lack of explicit punishment for Confederates was partially influenced by pressure from Southern landowners and businessmen who feared seeing their wealth and power jeopardized. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, believed that a soft approach would ease the country's restructuring, especially given the deep economic and social divides left by the war. However, by allowing many of these leaders to regain public office and reclaim their influence, Johnson inadvertently fostered a sense of impunity. Comparing this to other nations that faced similar civil conflicts reveals just how unique this approach was. In many places, retributive justice, applying strict punishment to prevent recurrence, was the dominant choice. But in the U.S., restorative justice took precedence, with reunification prioritized. This raises a critical question. Was sparing the Confederates a reflection of democratic values, or simply a strategy to prevent further strife? And in making this choice, what price did the nation pay in terms of justice for the victims of slavery and war? Impact of the decision: racial and political structures in the South. The choice not to punish the Confederate leaders had far-reaching consequences for the racial and political structures of the South. With these leaders returning to power and no significant structural reforms, the Southern United States quickly rebuilt a system that, though devoid of formal slavery, retained many of the racist ideals and practices present before the war. This post-Civil War period, known as Reconstruction, should have been an opportunity to transform the lives of freed Black people and usher in a new era of equality. But it was thwarted by the absence of exemplary punishment for those who had upheld the institution of slavery. Many Confederate leaders, even after surrender, refused to abandon their racist beliefs. They wielded their influence to implement state laws known as Black Codes, a set of legal restrictions severely limiting Black freedoms, preventing them from voting, accessing fair employment, and occupying public spaces. These laws laid the groundwork for what would become the Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination for nearly a century. By not fully dismantling Confederate power structures, the decision to forgive Southern leaders entrenched white supremacy as a lasting element in Southern politics and society. This created a barrier to any real progress toward racial equality and social justice. American society, especially in the South, was shaped by these choices, perpetuating racial inequalities that would affect future generations. Thus, the lack of punishment not only failed to uphold justice, it allowed old racist structures to re-emerge and adapt, keeping the spirit of a divided society alive for decades. Effects on culture and public perception. The failure to punish Confederate leaders not only influenced the South's political and racial landscape, it also shaped how the Civil War and its participants are portrayed in American popular culture. In the post-war period, the image of the Confederate soldier began to be reinterpreted, and the Confederate leaders were often romanticized in art, literature, and film. Instead of being seen as villains or traitors, some of these leaders came to be viewed as complex, even heroic figures fighting for their culture and way of life. This historical revisionism gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, giving rise to the movement known as the Lost Cause. This movement aimed to create a sentimental and honorable narrative about the Confederate South, framing the Civil War as a just and even noble fight, allegedly unrelated to slavery. Monuments were erected in honor of Confederate generals, schools were named after them, and revisionist stories became widespread in Southern textbooks and media. These cultural representations helped sustain an idealized view of the Civil War and the Confederates while downplaying the horrors of slavery and the leaders' responsibility for dividing and devastating the nation. As a result, public perception was deeply affected, leaving the collective understanding of the war and its real causes distorted. This cultural legacy continues to influence debates today, raising questions about how history is told and who holds the power to shape collective memory. Reflection on the justice system and concepts of justice. The decision to forgive Confederate leaders and reintegrate them into society raises fundamental questions about the concept of justice itself. In an ideal system, justice should be impartial, aiming to repair harm and prevent future injustices. However, in the Civil War context, this notion of justice was quickly overshadowed by the political need to pacify the country. The lack of formal punishment for Confederate leaders not only cast doubt on the effectiveness of justice at that historic moment, but also set a dangerous precedent. The idea that certain figures could escape the consequences of their actions if it served social stability. This episode clearly illustrates the tension between retributive and restorative justice. Retributive justice, which is more punitive, would have focused on applying strict penalties to hold individuals accountable and potentially deter future acts of rebellion or support for slavery. Restorative justice, on the other hand, seeks to rebuild society, promoting reconciliation between conflicting parties. In the U.S., restoration was chosen, but its implementation was flawed and uneven, favoring former Confederates' interests over those of newly freed Black Americans. This choice left a lasting impact on the American justice system, which still faces criticism today for its handling of racial inequality and systemic racism. By choosing the path of reconciliation without full accountability, the government at the time established a paradigm where justice appeared to be negotiable. This debate remains relevant, reflected in modern discussions about impunity and the limits of forgiveness in cases of crimes against humanity. It was a choice that created complex consequences and perhaps failed to fully address the needs of war and slavery's victims. Contemporary legacy, reflections in modern American society. The choices made regarding Confederate leaders after the Civil War left a deep, lasting impact on American society, with effects still visible today. The decision not to punish Confederates allowed white supremacist ideology to remain deeply embedded in many Southern states, laying the groundwork for the emergence of organized racist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and discriminatory laws such as Jim Crow laws. These systems of racial oppression became extensions of Confederate power structures, and the absence of firm justice enabled racial discrimination to be institutionalized in the United States for generations. The reflection of this past is still visible today, as historical events are revisited and racial issues remain at the forefront of social and political debates. Contemporary movements, such as Black Lives Matter, are rooted in the pursuit of justice and equity that was neglected after the Civil War. Instead of eradicating the Confederate legacy, the country chose to move on from the war without fully addressing its causes, creating a continuous cycle of racial tensions and systemic inequalities that still echo today. Forgiving the Confederates also paved the way for heated debates over the removal of Confederate monuments and symbols, which still adorn many Southern cities in the U.S. For many, these symbols represent a celebration of a racist, oppressive past. Yet, for others, they are viewed as part of Southern history and heritage. This conflict between memory and justice, between past and present, demonstrates just how much these historical decisions continue to shape American society, where the meaning of justice is continually reevaluated and, for some, finally questioned at a deeper level. As we reflect on the decisions made in the post-Civil War era, it's impossible not to question the price America paid for forgiving Confederate leaders. The promise of reconciliation came with a shadow of impunity, creating a legacy of inequality and racial divisions that the country is still struggling to overcome. The question that resonates today is simple but carries deep significance. Would justice have been better served if punishment had been imposed? Or was reconciliation the only possible path to keeping a nation together? This video has invited you to think beyond the surface, questioning the true meaning of justice and forgiveness in the context of betrayal and oppression. What does it mean to forgive without making amends? And what are the consequences of a reconciliation that leaves the responsible unaccountable? By understanding this complex history, we can view the present with a more critical and informed perspective, questioning how the past continues to shape our social and political structures today. We want to hear from you. How do you see the dilemma between justice and forgiveness? Was reconciliation enough, or was justice sacrificed for stability's sake? Leave your comments and join the discussion. Let's keep exploring history together, reflecting on what it teaches us and on what still needs to be addressed to build a